All right, gather round, because I need you to understand something that sounds like a conspiracy theory, but is actually a real, peer-reviewed, taught in every Psych 101 class phenomenon. If you believe someone is going to succeed, you can accidentally make it come true. Not with crystals, not with vibes, with your face. Your tone of voice, the 2 extra seconds you spend making eye contact with them. That's it. That's the whole trick. Scientists have tested this on rats, on children, in courtrooms, in the military, because apparently nowhere was safe, and it holds up disturbingly well. It's called the Rosenthal Effect, and once you learn it, you will never trust your own gut feelings about people again. And by the end of this video, I'm also going to tell you about its evil twin, the one where low expectations don't just fail to help someone, they actively wreck them. Buckle up. So who's Rosenthal? Robert Rosenthal was a psychologist obsessed with one specific question. If I expect something from you, does my expectation actually change your behavior? Not just how I perceive you, but what you genuinely do differently. That question turns out to run in a loop. My belief shapes how I treat you shapes how you see yourself shapes what you actually do, and what you do just walks right back around and confirms my original belief. Rosenthal spent his career proving that loop is real. And here's the part almost nobody mentions. He didn't start by testing it on people. He started with rats. 1963. Rosenthal and a colleague named Fode hand out a batch of completely standard run-of-the-mill lab rats to a group of students and tell them to train the rats through a maze. Half the students are told, these are maze-bright rats, specially bred for speed. Expect a lot from them. The other half are told, sorry, you got the maze dull batch. Don't get your hopes up. There was no bright batch. There was no dull batch. Every single rat came from the exact same stock, handed out completely at random. But by the end of the trials, the smart rats were genuinely running the maze faster, with fewer wrong turns, than the dull ones. The rats hadn't changed, the handling had. Students who thought they had gifted rats held them more, handled them more gently, gave them more attempts, more patience, all without ever consciously deciding to treat one rat differently than another. Rosenthal looked at that data and thought something slightly unhinged. If a rat can absorb your expectations just from the way you physically pick it up, what happens if you run this exact trick on children? So he teamed up with a school principal named Lenore Jacobson and took it into a real elementary school. Every student takes an IQ test at the start of the year. Real test, real scores, filed away. Then Rosenthal goes to the teachers and tells them he's administering a brand new assessment, something he calls the Harvard Test of Inflected Acquisition, which can supposedly predict which kids are about to have an intellectual growth spurt. He hands them a list of names to keep an eye on this year. The names were random. There was no special test behind that list. It was a coin flip wearing a lab coat. A year later, they retest every single kid in the school. The randomly labeled bloomers had measurably, statistically outperformed their equally average classmates. Same kids who would have been completely unremarkable on paper the year before, except one adult in the room had quietly decided they were going somewhere and had treated them that way for an entire school year without ever being told to and without ever realizing they were doing it. So what actually happened in that classroom? Did the teachers develop psychic powers? No. Worse. And dumber. And way more human than that. They just got warmer. In ways researchers later broke down into 4 specific channels. Climate. Teachers were friendlier, smiled more, made more eye contact with the kids they believed in. Input. They quietly taught the bloomers more material, pushed them a little further. Opportunity. They called on those kids more often and waited longer for them to answer instead of jumping to someone else. Feedback. When a bloomer got something wrong, they got a detailed explanation of how to improve instead of just a correction. Multiply 4 tiny advantages like that by 180 school days, and you've built a kid a personal tutor made entirely out of vibes they were never told they were getting. And that's the piece that makes this Rosenthal's discovery, and not just, be nice to kids, kids do better. The belief came first, completely unprompted by anything real, and the behavior followed it automatically. Nobody chose to run an experiment on their own students. Their brains just could not help but treat people differently based on an expectation planted by a total stranger with a clipboard. Here's the part most people never hear, because it's the uncomfortable half of the story. In 1982, Rosenthal teamed up with researchers Babad and Inbar to ask the obvious follow-up question. If high expectations lift people up, what do low expectations do? Not nothing. That's the disturbing answer. They actively drag performance down. Researchers named it the Golem Effect, after a creature from Jewish folklore, a being made of clay, brought to life to serve, but flawed from the start and eventually destroyed because of it. Run those same 4 channels in reverse. Less warmth, less eye contact, colder body language. Less material, easier assignments, lower expectations baked right into the workload. Fewer chances to answer, less patience waiting for a response. And when the person does get something wrong, vaguer, harsher, less useful feedback. In the actual studies, teachers who'd been told certain kids had low potential treated those randomly labeled kids with noticeably less enthusiasm and more criticism, and the kids' scores dropped to match. Nobody sat those kids down and said, "We don't believe in you." Nobody had to. It leaked out the exact same way the good version does, just pointed in the opposite direction. That's the actual headline here. This isn't a nice story about how belief can help people. It's a much scarier story about how your face, unsupervised, is constantly deciding who gets to rise and who gets quietly held down. Okay, I have to be the annoying guy for a second, because I'd be lying if I told you this was uncontested. Plenty of researchers who tried to rerun the original Oak School study got a much smaller effect, sometimes none at all, which is a real scientific problem, not a footnote. Critics at the time also raised something politically loaded. Telling the public kids fail because their teachers didn't believe in them conveniently distracts from underfunded schools, overcrowded classrooms, and poverty. One prominent teachers' union leader was scathing about it, essentially arguing the theory let every structural failure in education off the hook by pinning it on teacher attitude instead. That criticism was fair, and it stuck. But Rosenthal didn't just leave it at one shaky elementary school. He and a Harvard statistician later pooled data from over 300 related expectancy studies across wildly different settings: doctors' offices, courtrooms, military training. And the pattern kept resurfacing. Not always huge, not always dramatic, but real enough that decades and multiple failed replications later, this is still taught seriously in psychology programs, not laughed out of the room. Quick mythology detour, because it's genuinely the best part of this whole story. In Greek myth, a sculptor named Pygmalion carves a statue so beautiful that he falls in love with his own creation and begs the gods to bring it to life. They do. Centuries later, playwright George Bernard Shaw recycled that idea into a play about a professor who transforms a flower girl into someone who can pass as a duchess through nothing but training and belief. A story you almost certainly know as My Fair Lady. So when Rosenthal needed a name for believing in someone so hard they become what you believed, the myth was already sitting there, fully loaded. And when his colleagues needed a name for the ugly opposite, folklore's flawed clay creature was right there too. Once you know this loop exists in both directions, you start spotting it everywhere, and it gets uncomfortable fast. At work, a manager meets 2 new hires on the same day. One has easy, confident energy that reminds them of their favorite former coworker. The other is a little awkward, a little quiet, and reminds them, unfairly, of someone who used to slow down every meeting at their last job. Neither has done a single real day of work yet, and the manager's brain has already placed its bets. Months later, one of them is thriving and one is struggling, and it looks like the manager had good instincts all along. They didn't. They built it. At home, a parent has two kids, and somewhere around age 6, one gets quietly filed away as the smart one, and the other as the difficult one. Nobody says it out loud, but the smart one gets more patient explanations, more benefit of the doubt, more, "I know you can figure this out." The difficult one gets shorter tempers, lower expectations, more supervision, and less trust. 10 years later, everyone points to the results as proof they'd read the kids correctly from the start. In sports, a coach sizes up a roster on day one based on nothing but a first impression and starts unconsciously investing extra minutes, extra encouragement, extra patience in the players who look promising, while the ones who don't get less feedback and less playing time to prove themselves. The gap that shows up by the end of the season isn't just talent. Some of it is Rosenthal wearing a whistle. So, can you hack this? Can you just decide to believe hard in yourself or in someone else and force better outcomes? Not exactly, and I want to be honest about that instead of selling you something. The effect isn't really belief in some mystical sense. It's belief that leaks out through 100 concrete physical behaviors. Warmth, eye contact, how much material you offer someone, how long you wait for their answer, how detailed your feedback is when they get it wrong. Which actually makes it more useful, not less. Because those 4 channels are things you can deliberately control, even on days your gut instinct is unfairly negative about someone. You can't will yourself into magically believing in a person you're skeptical of. But you can choose to give them the warmth, the material, the response time, and the detailed feedback anyway. And the research suggests the outcomes tend to follow the behavior, not just the belief. Here's the part that should actually stick with you. This was never really about rats or IQ tests or a fake Harvard-sounding exam from the 1960s or a clay monster from Jewish folklore. It's about the fact that your expectations are not private. They leak out through 100 tiny skills you don't even know you're sending, and the people around you absorb them and start acting accordingly, for better or for genuinely worse. So the useful question isn't, is this effect real or fake? It's, who in your life is quietly getting the bloomer treatment from you right now? And who got written off before you ever had real evidence either way? Because according to a guy who tricked a school full of teachers and a room full of rat handlers in the 1960s, that decision might already be shaping the outcome. If your brain just went, wait, am I doing this to someone right now? Good, that's the whole point. Tell me in the comments who you're going to go believe in a little harder this week.